3, 2, 1. We are live. Very good, very good. We are now live. All righty. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Friday and happy first day of December, for that matter. I cannot believe it is already December 2023. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. We're actually testing out the new lapel mic connected straight to my computer tower. This is something I recently ordered during our little Cyber Monday affair back this earlier in the week. This was the last little piece of the puzzle for my future green screen setup, which once again, the boxes are right there over my shoulder. So they're there, they're ready to go. I just have not had any time to set them up. So hopefully you guys can hear me wonderfully. This is the quality of the audio that's going to be coming through when I do my stand-up briefings. And as you can already see, I already feel a lot more at ease and more lively and a little more animated than if I had this big old microphone in front of my face. So strides in the right direction. Every now and again, I might bring the microphone back if we're doing a more intimate conversation, but, you know, we'll see. But, all right, so before we get started, I'm going to throw this immediate disclaimer out there before maybe anyone comes across this video and suggests that we're hyping something that's still almost a year away. This is for scientific purposes only. And when I say that, I mean that in all seriousness. These are conversations that we should be having amongst the weather community, and I have a few articles, I should say, that are pulled up to support the fact that other meteorological sources are already talking about the same thing, as well as a little bit of the science behind why it is next year is going to be crucial that we look at it from an experimental perspective and try to draw some good hypotheses and conclusions, not only before, but during and then after the fact. We want to make sure we write up a really good after-action report for what 2024 could have in store for us. So all in all, folks, I want to let you know in advance, this is definitely entirely speculative. This is entirely a long range preliminary forecast or whatever you want to call it. But we are going to be breaking down why it is we do, as an atmospheric science community, want to approach 2024's hurricane season, have these conversations well in advance to begin discussion of hypotheses and theories before it gets started, because then we're going to be scrambling to come up with a scientific method on how to approach it. And when I say that, I genuinely mean it. I really want us to look into this from a very scientific standpoint and try to draw conclusions centered around the anomalous activity we had this year moving into 2024, when the atmosphere and the oscillating patterns around most of the northern hemisphere, most of the globe for that matter, will be in a neutral state. So this will be a relaxed atmospheric pattern. We won't have any bias in one direction or the other. So I think this is a very critical time for us to sit down as a collective unit and begin to discuss how we want to interpolate and analyze the precursors to the hurricane season, what we continue to see in our El Nino oscillation, if that waxes and wanes any more as we go over December, January, and February and into springtime of next year, alongside how we want to approach the hurricane season. All right. I know that's a long-winded disclaimer. We're already 3 minutes into the stream and it was just me rambling on. We'll go ahead and pause and start saying hello to everybody. Carmen, I see your name popping up. Welcome in, unless that was earlier. Nomad Cat 4, welcome in. I predict 2024 is going to be a repeat of 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. It could. We can look at that tonight very briefly. I'm definitely leaning more towards 2004. And I know that there is a bit of a personal bias towards my liking of 2004. But I think just based on the dynamics that we have in the macro scale across North, South America, the Pacific, the Atlantic, everything combined, I think we're going to have a bit of, perhaps not a mirror image of 2004, but we're going to have to really look at the possibility of seeing more landfalls than we did this year, especially as we rotate out of an El Nino pattern. Sounds good. Very good. I'm glad to hear that you guys hear me loud and clear. Scrooge, welcome in. Zenful, hello there. Mick and Marley, good evening. Good to see you. Thomas Denton, hello there. Thank you for joining us. Ethan, thanks for joining. Welcome in. Gary put up some Christmas lights today. Just got done and my shirt is soaked from sweat. Yeah, we're back up into the 80s, trying to hit the mid to upper 80s as we go through the day tomorrow and Sunday, unfortunately, before our next cold plunge. So, 2003 Atlantic hurricane season should be looked out then. We could. I know that 2003 was an El Nino, though, so we don't really want to look too heavily into that. Wow, hello there, Melanie from Ontario, Canada. Thank you very much for joining us. Very impressive to have someone tuning in from Canada. It's very nice to see. 2004 was a year, I agree. And I did not know this. It was actually yesterday's live stream where we discovered that 2003 was the El Nino hurricane season. In 2004 started with a weak El Nino. No, excuse me. 2004 started with, 2004 started with a weak oscillation into an El Nino. So very, very interesting how next year we're going to be flipping the tables. And that's exactly why instead of making a video, I'm just going to go live so we can be very casual about it, very unedited, very, raw and just casual to the point. We're going to do a brief update just as we always do. We're going to go ahead and update everybody because I haven't been putting out full coverage on the channel for a little bit now. So we'll talk. We have this very, very frivolous looking tropical wave out there that's almost stationary in the Atlantic. It's been kind of hovering between the 30 and 20 degree longitude lines for quite a while now. We had a nice flare up of thunderstorm activity with it during the day today and overnight yesterday. Very funny. I was joking around about this yesterday, but there's actually people making videos on it and mentioning that there are some probabilities of development. And I'm like, I was kidding, guys. Like, there's no reason. But anyways, a little sidebar note right there. We have another big old frontal system that's coming through. I think this frontal system is going to help to try to intensify possible rain chances for the Leeward Islands, parts of Puerto Rico and the Greater Antilles as you move a little further to the west, because you can see where that frontal line is trying to sag a little bit further to the south. And if I clear my ink, you can see it beginning to make its approach towards the Greater Antilles and maybe the northern periphery of the Leeward Islands. So that could possibly be increasing rain chances. We'll definitely want to watch this convective flare-up, even though it will remain heavily sheared apart. Some of the long-range models are thinking that maybe as we get closer to the Guyanas and the very, very southernmost tip of the Windward Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, trying to etch their way into the very southernmost Windward Islands of the Lesser Antilles chain, they could see some increased rainfall. I've been seeing some channels mentioning that we could possibly see very heavy rainfall, upwards of over a foot of rain, and I am not seeing anything to support that. I'm not going to go off the chain. GFS, of course, it's the GFS. We're seeing maybe some very, very small pockets for the Trinidad and Tobago area where they could see some increased rainfall, but even that we can explore a little bit on the channel tonight. We'll talk about it a little bit. Rest of the Caribbean is very calm and cool and collected still. We could see a little bit of an increase in thunderstorm activity for El Salvador and Belize as we go over the next 7 to 10 days. And then there you have it. There's our low latitude jet still flying across Mexico into the southern plains and the southeast. Good rainfall activity for the Gulf Coast. They have some pretty good training thunderstorms going on and a little bit of an energetic flare-up in the Gulf of Mexico, trying to push into the panhandle of Florida for that matter. So yeah, there you go. We have this big old nor'easter, and it makes sense. Melanie, you mentioned that it's snowing. We have this huge pole of cold air coming around this system in the northeast. So that's just going to continue to funnel the rainfall and the rain-snow line along the backside of it as that polar air comes down. And then we have another system we want to watch for. And actually, we'll go ahead and switch gears a little bit. We'll go over to the east side. Can I go over to the eastern part of the United States? We'll go to the United States just so we can take a quick glance. So if you look out there over the Pac Northwest, our atmospheric river has started. It has officially kicked off, and you could see very, very, very strong jet level winds just shoving low pressure and rainfall into the Pacific Northwest, right along the windward portion of the Cascade Mountain Range. We're going to see a lot of rainfall, very, very heavy accumulations as we go over the next 7 to 10 days. I can take you through that as well very briefly. We have another very weak low latitude system pushing across the desert Southwest. You can see it moving across the Central Rockies, the Four Corners. Nothing really anticipated to form up with that. Another little embedded low vortice at most, trying to tap in and create another secondary cold push for the heart of the United States and move up towards the Great Lakes. But yeah, there you have it. That's our very, very quick, abbreviated, and crazy fast, if you will, update across the United States. But so this is the tagline, one of many taglines for this live stream. And I entirely agree with this. The 2023 hurricane season is over, but provides warnings for next year. And I'm very glad that we have official sources starting to talk about this. And I definitely agree with the statement that's tagged right underneath that headline. There are certainly flashing lights that we need to pay real close attention to for the 2024 hurricane season, says one meteorologist. And in layman's terms, essentially all they're saying is we had very, very erroneous situations unfold for a majority of this hurricane season. And that's why I think as we rotate out of a biased pattern in terms of our oscillations, El Nino or La Nina, typically for the general public, we always like to discuss how El Nino means no hurricanes, La Nina means every hurricane. And that's another reason why I'm starting to do research on different articles that are being published, whether they be by mainstream news sources, local media sources, or other meteorological sources, because folks are starting to notice that clearly, even though the El Nino steering pattern was there to keep these storms away from most of the United States, most of the Caribbean, the Bahamas for that matter, and the Gulf of Mexico, that doesn't mean we're going to have that protective barrier of El Nino stopping hurricane season altogether. If you guys remember, we very quickly ramped up our anticipation and our expectancy of what this hurricane season was supposed to look like as we got through January, then through March, and then through May, and then June, July, and even August. There was a revised forecast for what the hurricane season could look like this year. And it's very comforting to know that we have other scientists and other meteorologists, atmospheric science enthusiasts, whoever you want to put on the table, discussing the same kind of parameters. We can kind of glaze through it very quickly just to kind of get a better understanding of what the conclusion that you can pull from this. The 2023 Atlantic hurricane season began with competing forces. There was a lot of debate on whether or not El Nino was going to smother the hurricane season or these record warm temperatures were going to win. And unfortunately, we noticed immediately that the record warm temperatures across the Atlantic basin won the war for all intents and purposes. And it almost helped to reduce the amount of wind shear that we saw from El Nino across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, which is why we saw Hurricane Idalia and Tropical Storm Harold try to make their way across that area. We could argue that Tropical Storm Ophelia kind of did something similar to that since it formed off the coast of Florida and then moved to the north, but the same parameters were not under the gun at that same point in time, nor did we have the same environmental dynamics affecting Tropical Storm Ophelia's development. I personally I know this is you've heard this probably countless times from me specifically on my channel. I still think we need to re-examine that storm and determine if it was more tropical or subtropical, maybe with a tiny cluster of tropical energy in its core as it moved over the Gulf Stream. A lot of the characteristics of that storm looked a lot more like a baroclinic, low with fronts attached to it, and it was directly underneath our jet. So, anyways, this year's unusual season is more than just fodder for weather buffs and water cooler conversations. It may also provide insight for next year's hurricane season. Weather records show that strong El Nino like this year's is unlikely to return next season. So typically, when we go into an El Nino pattern or a La Nina, just like what we talked about yesterday for those of you joining tonight, we used the metaphor of cars, building cars. When you go too strong with the horsepower, with the torque, and you race the vehicle, something's going to break. It's kind of the same thing with our atmospheric patterns. If you go too strong with an El Nino or a La Nina, if you warm something up or you cool something down too fast, a state of equilibrium has to return one way or another. And that's why a lot of long-range experts or long-range forecasts are looking like we're going to repeat that El Nino to La Nina transition and maybe kind of teeter-totter back and forth between the two because we have an aggressive El Nino brewing in the Pacific currently. And with that bubbling up and all the transitional trade wind patterns and prevailing winds that we have across the northern hemisphere kind of doing their thing, what's going to end up happening is that warm water's got to be displaced somewhere, and that's what's going to allow for those areas to cool and probably bring us into more of a neutral with a wavering between maybe neutral La Nina, neutral La Nina. And that's one of the key takeaways as we go into next year. That's why I think we need to start discussing the possibilities of seeing another above average season and let alone a dangerous season, because experts and trends already suggest that we're not going to have that protective barrier of El Nino for too much longer. Even if we go into a neutral season, I actually have some very good charts I want to show you guys. A neutral season is just as dangerous as a La Nina, and don't let the numbers and everything fool you. El Nino, we saw some action. La Nina, we see plenty of action. Neutral, just because we're kind of in between transitions, doesn't necessarily mean, oh, well, it's going to be average. No, we'll get up to there in a moment. It's impossible to make solid predictions about next year's hurricane season. Is this one ending? That's the main point of this video. That's why I mentioned this whole documentary, I guess you can call it, in this live stream is more or less just speculating how we should approach forecasting the next hurricane season. We can forecast some of the very, very large scale anomalies like sea surface temperatures, what our patterns are doing in the macro scale and then the synoptic scale in terms of our semi-permanent pressure systems, because some people are also arguing that if we do have very warm waters in the Atlantic on a consistent basis, will this forever change the way we see landfalling hurricanes? Because technically speaking, if we have high pressure over the Atlantic that typically likes to situate itself over cooler waters, as the ocean warms up, those highs are going to migrate to the north, to the northeast, closer to the Azores, and allow more fish storm tracks to take place, because we're not going to have it crushing up against Bermuda, funneling storms through the Caribbean, towards the Bahamas, God forbid, towards the southeast or the mid-Atlantic states, some escaping into the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a lot of different things we need to start looking at now to make sure that we are ahead of the game when it comes time to make our preliminary tropical cyclone forecasts. Most of the time, people think El Nino is synonymous with we're going to have a dead hurricane season, and that was not the case here. And that's why a lot of people are actually having these conversations in other platforms, whether it be on social media, behind the scenes, in a collective unit, in a meeting group, or a conference. People are starting to definitely think, if El Nino is not preventing tropical cyclone development, how active could a hurricane season get if we do see a resurgence of very, very abnormally hot temperatures? And with that being said, I have a very, very great trend line graph to show you guys. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. So check this out. What we have here is going to be an archival of our sea surface temperatures going all the way back to the 1980s up until current time. And if you look at the trends, unfortunately, as you go through time, the overall consensus is it's been warming. This was the average. This was 1982. Where did I lost it? This is 1982. And notice if you look, it might be a little difficult for you to spot. I'll go ahead and draw it on my marker here. 1982, right about where this chart began, typically it fell right in this general region of our spaghetti plot, if you want to call it that. This was 2022. And I want to fast forward right to about when Hurricane Ian hit, because this is scary. This is very scary. And I mean that. And I'm not fear-mongering. It's just I'm looking back on old footage. I haven't been looking, but if Diva is with us right now, I know she had mentioned what was going on with Hurricane Ian and other folks who were directly affected by Hurricane Ian. Look at the difference in temperatures during the period of time when Hurricane Ian was brewing, not only in the Caribbean, but then when it went into rapid intensification, into a Category 5, a confirmed Category 5 off the shore of Florida. Look at the difference from September 25th. We'll go to September 27th, because that was about the day it made landfall. September 27th, September 28th was when it underwent rapid intensification. We were at 24.5 degrees on average across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, everywhere pretty much. Look at the difference. 24.5 to 24.7. And I know that sounds very, very tiny, like, oh, but David, you're hyping at 0.2 degree difference. What I'm trying to make the case here is that's the average for the entire tropical AOR. When you factor in the differences in temperatures, we know that the ocean heat content was through the roof where Ian first formed up. So one could argue if we saw a reminiscent pattern form up between now and next year, and we have another Ian-like storm or a Caribbean traveler that moves through there, we could possibly see a major hurricane already in the works, hitting Jamaica, hitting the Cayman Islands, going through Cuba, and then becoming even stronger after it comes across and moves towards Florida or the Gulf Coast. That's what I'm trying to say here. It doesn't seem like much when you compare the average, but then come on over here to the heart of the hurricane season where we really see the peak kick off. We had a full almost 1.5 degrees average for the whole. Remember, guys, this chart is the entire ocean. See the numbers up here from 0 to 60 degree latitude, 0 to 80 degrees west longitude. This is the entire basin, the average difference. So if the average difference for the entire basin was about about a quarter of a degree bigger on average, one can speculate that a lot of these quadrants or these regions with which these storms travel over are probably 1 degree or 2, if not 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the typical average anomaly. And if we're looking at almost 1.5 degrees more on average for much of the Atlantic through pretty much the first, middle, and the latter portions of the hurricane season. It looks like we're trying to come back down to a norm as we go towards December. But even then, the writing's on the wall. What's scary is, are we going to continue to see these anomalous jumps in temperature, or are they going to be more gradual? Was this the jump? Was this a transitional iceberg that we hit, and now it'll once again go back to a gradual period of increasing and warming? Or are we going to start to see more exponential increases in our surface temperatures across the platform? That's another area of concern and curiosity that strikes a lot of us. So, before we get any further into the live stream, sorry, Nazar, stupid Thomas question again. It's never a stupid question, Thomas. Stop putting yourself down like that. El Nino and La Nina, I don't understand. Is it like, for example, a winter versus summer thing? Not necessarily. There you go. PM got the answer. It's an oscillation of temperatures. Yeah, so basically, in layman's terms, Thomas, it's the flowing of ocean waters, if you will, and the differences in temperatures as those cold or those warm masses of underwater temps, if you want to call it that, for lack of a better term, migrate around the Pacific, around the Atlantic. There's different oscillations across the planet in association with our ocean currents, and the way the prevailing wind flow and the jets affect the way these waters transport their energy across the planet, whether it be in the northern or southern hemisphere, the western and eastern hemisphere. All the oceans have different currents because of the different atmospheric dynamics going on. That's why the ocean and the atmosphere actually go hand in hand in terms of forecasting our weather and what seasonal outlooks will look like. A Caribbean cruiser, yeah. That's what I want to call it, Caribbean cruisers. So anyways, let's go ahead and start looking at some of the climatology model, because I looked at the CANSIPs and we're still seeing that trend of seeing a very open tropical Atlantic next year. Let me see. I pulled this up earlier and I just want to remember. Okay, so this is our latest run of the CFS, the climate forecasting system. We're looking at the globe here, and essentially all we're looking at is what the models are still thinking is going to happen next year. This is June, this is July, and then here's August. Now, you could see that we do have these blue shadings here. However, in order to get an aggressive La Nina or a full-fledged La Nina like we saw with 2021 or 20 through 23, we would need to go about 1 degree to 1.5 degrees cooler than the oceanic average. In this case, the climatology models do think that we're going to sway into a very weak El Nina, a very weak La Nina, with a more so neutral pattern across the delineation between our eastern Pacific and into the Atlantic basin, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, where we see a reflection of what El Nino does to our patterns. So not a huge warning there in terms of if we're going to have an extra favorable tropical Atlantic or simply a favorable tropical Atlantic. And that's why I really want to open the floor up. And I honestly wish that this live stream would reach other weather sources on YouTube, because I think we should all come together in a collective effort to digest what our long-range climate models are trying to tell us, what we can draw in terms of conclusive data from this hurricane season. And I mean a bunch of different parameters. What ocean temperatures looked like as things warmed into an El Nino. Did El Nino play a role in how hot things got over here this year? Because we have a very aggressive El Nino. So perhaps El Nino is impacting a little bit of the waters on the Atlantic side of things. Very highly unlikely, unfortunately, because you have the crossing of air masses, and obviously the water isn't going to just go underneath the land. That's not how it works. But nonetheless, there could be something internally going on that we're not realizing just yet that could play hand in hand with why El Nino is coming on as strong as it is, and why we're seeing the synoptic energy being redistributed as such. So CFS is on board with us, wandering closer to neutral / a weak La Nina, which, again, neutral is all you need for a really strong and potent hurricane season. Here's the CANSIPs. So right here I have August pulled up so we can do a little bit of verification with the model first before we look into the most recent data. As you scroll through time, you can see the very, very vigorous El Nino, which is ongoing. It's right on the money in terms of forecasting the El Nino period that we're going into. This is January, February, and then March notice. So we'll have to really watch closely as we go through February to April. if at any point in time during February, March, or April, we do start to see those El Nino conditions start to continuously but gradually come down, we know that right then out of the gate, we need to start looking at what hurricane season is going to look like. And that's regardless of surface temperatures in the ocean heat content. Because obviously, if we have El Nino boiling into next season, we can kind of estimate that even if we do see a lot of aggressive storms, they're going to go up into the ocean and they're not going to affect anybody. If we do start seeing that gradual decrease in our sea surface anomalies in the Pacific leading towards that neutral phase, we already know we got to start bolstering our efforts to prepare people for hurricane season, because that's going to change the layout of the atmosphere across the mid-latitudes, the polar regions, and exactly where our steering currents will set themselves up when it comes time to open the doors to hurricane season 2024. April, we're seeing cooling. May, we're seeing cooling. And then June, we start to see a little bit of what could possibly be an indication of a weak La Nina, if not a neutral phase, creeping in there. Now let's go to the most recent model data. So this is as of today, December 1st. Fresh 0Z data from the CANSIPs. And you can see as we go into next year, we're looking at a very, very good chance at a neutral to a weak La Nina. That's why if you guys look right in through here, there's the white shading followed by some indications that we might see a bit of a strengthening La Nina. And when I say strengthening, I mean just, looking more like a weak La Nina as opposed to a neutral phase. I'm not hyping it up and saying full La Nina for next year. No, you got to make sure you understand the colors here. We have some indications that some of our regions out there, the zones as they call them, could be about maybe 1 to 1.5 degrees cooler than the climatological norm, which would indicate we're going into a La Nina. That doesn't mean full-fledged La Nina is in place. We have more of a neutral pattern setting up for our areas. So we'll have an even playing field from the Eastern Pacific to the Atlantic. So with that being said, this is what I know everyone has been wanting to look at. Let's go back to our regions and let's go to the North Atlantic. Let's come back here and we'll first and foremost take a look at what our models are thinking. So we have all those hot temperatures out there in the Gulf, Caribbean, and across the Atlantic. And as you go into hurricane season, you notice that we're still anticipating that we could be about 1 degree to 2 degrees warmer where it matters the most. The Caribbean source region, parts of the Gulf of Mexico, and some of the MDR. That is the name of the game for much of what they're anticipating for next hurricane season. And just like we're seeing right now, by November, we'll start to slowly cool down in the Gulf. Problem is, we really need to pay close attention to what our ocean heat content does, more so in the Gulf, not in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean. Because again, I know there were a lot of video sources out there who said, ocean heat content. Yeah, but in an El Nino season, you don't even really need to pay close attention to ocean heat content in a region like that because El Nino is going to keep a dang lid on it. It's like putting a pot of boiling water to steam and you put the lid on it, the bubbles are going to disappear. It's the same concept. Or when you have a fire brewing and you put a lid over it, it's going to burn out. You have all that untapped ocean heat content that was available, but we had the weather player El Nino preventing it from being tapped into. So now one of the main questions a lot of people have, including myself, for next hurricane season is what happens if we plant a storm over a favorable environment, no El Nino, just neutral, for example, and we allow it to feed off of that ocean heat content. I believe we had a cumulative ACE value of about, I think, in conclusion for this hurricane season, about 164, somewhere in the 160-ish area. I remember reading it, but I didn't write it down. We could see ACE values for the tropics go higher than that if we have a very similar oceanic pattern setup or an oceanic layout, as opposed to when we've had stronger storms with lesser oceanic conditions. Now, this is what I've been having my eye on for a while now. Let me go back to the beginning so I don't spoil anything. Now, if you notice, for January, February, and March, we're still looking at a bit of an El Nino setup. We have a lot of increased anomalous moisture activity presented for the eastern half of the United States going up to the northeast, and we're still thinking that the Panhandle, especially in northern Florida, could see some increased moisture activity as a result of the El Nino steering current. Once we start to get out of El Nino, though, notice how the climo models are definitely thinking that we're going to go from a very dry Caribbean to a very moist. And then there's the start of the hurricane season. And the reason I'm concerned about this is because we already have what looks to be an open MDR and an open channel for possible storm systems and increased rainfall moving through like this. And that remains the entire story as you go through July, August, September, October, and even November. So especially August. This is why I really want us to lean on, was it 146? Maybe I got them flipped. 146. But I know it was up there. It was a very whopping, amount in comparison to what we've seen in the past. I look back at 2004 as our neutral season, and I look at what some of our climo models are predicting, and this, especially for August, that worries me because this has been verifying run to run consistently. So that's very interesting that the climo model is thinking we're going to have so much voluptuous increase in rainfall, not only over the tropical Atlantic, but especially for our folks in the Caribbean, the Lesser Antilles, and Florida. I'm really leaning to saying next hurricane season could possibly be open season for a lot of people. And if we have erroneous temperatures out there, that could mean very, very bad setups for a lot of people. We thought covering the likes of Hurricane Tammy, Tropical Storm Philippe, and Tropical Storm Franklin and whatnot was bad. I don't know how I would feel if I would be sitting here reporting on major hurricane so-and-so moving through the Lesser Antilles, or God forbid, we're out here storm chasing major hurricane so-and-so here in the state of Florida. Very real possibilities we'll have to explore because the models are really thinking that we're going to have a return to form in terms of our oscillations. And the reason this whole area is completely void of precip is because the models are thinking we're going to have a very well-established Central Atlantic Azores high, driving a lot of our storms in this direction. And that's the big thing. For a lot of this hurricane season, it was very weird. Our Atlantic high is what we'll call it, because it wanders between Bermuda and Azores. That high pressure was very, very weirdly positioned like this, because we had upper level troughing out here, which allowed the storms to take a majority of the path out to sea in the Central Atlantic. And I'm not too sure why we're getting ads, because I definitely turned them off this time unless YouTube automatically plugged one in because we just hit the half an hour mark. That's the only thing I can think of. I definitely changed the settings this time around. So if you look this time, the models are definitely thinking that our trough is going to be set up somewhere over mainland United States, allowing for high pressure to situate itself, which would mean a large majority of our storms are going to be going this way, and going this way. So we really need to start exploring the possibilities of seeing one, if not more, landfalls here in the southeast and seeing more storms managing to get through into the Caribbean and going through the Caribbean. I'm not talking what the storms did this year where we get a close shave with the Lesser Antilles like this. I mean busting through the Lesser Antilles and moving to the south of our Greater Antilles to where Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and Cuba become a target. So we'll see what happens. But that's what I'm picking up on. I'm not only looking at the moisture and how much more moisture there could be. I'm looking at where we have the drier conditions. Because where the drier conditions are located, those are where our semi-permanent pressure systems and our long wave features are likely to be present, steering whatever does form. It's not a matter of just looking at colors and saying, oh, look, the rain. No, you can make educated guesses and infer that we're going to have a very big old high rotating out here. We may have a long wave trough in the jet digging in across the northern tier, scooping things up out like this, which already changes the target zone for a lot of our areas that were previously unaffected and unscathed entirely this hurricane season. Let's see, where is my one chart I want to get to? I love this chart. Where are we at? I know I have it pulled up. Aha, here we go. So take a look at this. what's very interesting is if you look at this depiction here, all hurricanes categories 1 through 5, I need my drink of water. All hurricanes category 1 through 5. Notice how in El Nino we still got quite a bit, but notice we didn't have as many go through the Caribbean. The few that made it through the Atlantic where they were safe from a lot of that wind shear did make it into the Gulf. But notice how there's a concerning trend with the neutral setup as opposed to La Nina. So one could make a case that a neutral pattern in terms of our oceanic temps and currents and our prevailing winds will shift the general landfall region, or the target area, if you will, closer to Florida and closer to our greater Antilles. Because if you look, there's some very faint trends that you can pick up on here. El Nino overall, very, this is something that is being explored as we speak right now, that possibly El Nino, we could see more long track hurricanes because of how hot the oceans are. But notice that there really is no discernible pattern here for El Nino. We have about the same on average out over the Atlantic and the same on average over the Caribbean. And also notice that a lot of our storms are weaker. In the Atlantic, we have stronger storms, just like we saw with Lee, with Nigel, with Margot, with Don, and with, who else was out there? Suddenly drew a blank. With Tropical Storm Philippe strengthening a little bit after it pulled away from the Lesser Antilles. Franklin strengthened after it pulled away. Notice how a lot of our storms down here in the Caribbean didn't really get going, if any at all. We had mainly tropical depressions and tropical storms until they made hurricane status, and a few of them managed to hold on to their more strong hurricane status into the Gulf, kind of like what Idalia did. But now if we pay close attention to what happens in a neutral phase, notice how the bulk of our storms are right in through here. And then in a La Nina, the bulk of our storms are right in through here. See the little bit of a trend that we're picking up on here? So it's almost like the neutral phase is going to set us up to where just the right amount of steering flow is going to provide the room for, or I guess you could say the margin of error for these storms to take some potentially lethal tracks. And I don't want to alarm everybody who's watching from Florida, but I'm noticing that Florida is underneath a lot more spaghetti during a neutral pattern than it is in a La Nina or an El Nino. In fact, I would rank it, El Nino is in third, La Nina is in second, and neutral is in first. And one could make a future long-range prediction that during a La Nina, it's Texas and Louisiana who really have to watch out big time, with some threats to Florida, depending on how high of a latitude of a storm we get in the greater Atlantic or in the Caribbean, depending on the time of year, of course, as well. But notice how the general consensus is Texas is kind of spared. Louisiana takes some landfalls, but there's a lot of action for Cuba, for the Bahamas, and for Florida, and especially the mid-Atlantic states. So a neutral season could be a little worse for some than a La Nina. And it's very cool. I'm glad I found this chart because you can kind of make a case that neutral, on average, we're going to see storms take a greater track over the greater Antilles. And then in a La Nina, you see a large majority of them moving like this. Which makes sense because if you think about it, El Nino positions our semi-permanent systems in the mid to upper levels of the atmosphere further out to where we get a lot of fish storms. In a La Nina, you would imagine, well, it's the opposite, so a lot of those same influences are going to be closer, so more storms coming in, but taking a more westerly track. So if you break even and go to that neutral playing field, that even ground, you set it up, and like I'd made a case for when we were looking at our Climo model here, and this lines up. They're going to be doing a lot of this. There's going to be a lot of this going on possibly next year. And I'll change the color for you guys. El Nino was like this for a lot of our storms. Some managed to make it in, obviously. And then La Nina on the other chart, a lot of those spaghettis had them moving in like this. So it's definitely something to watch out for. Definitely something we want to make sure we're watching out for. And we definitely want to start watching what our sea surface temps do and what El Nino starts to do as we roll into the first half, or the first quarter, I should say, of 2024. And that's why, even if I get a lot of flame for this video and other videos I may do as we go month to month, I don't really care at this point. People can come in and, trash talk or whatever, but I think I'm standing on firm ground, and I'd like to think a lot of you guys watching agree that there's a lot of things we could be watching before hurricane season comes up to get a general thought pattern and a theory as to where we could be watching most of our storms barrel through. And the problem with a neutral to a La Nina phase is that's only going to allow the upper levels of the atmosphere more favorability to allow these storms to grow. So with these tracks here, we could be seeing stronger systems. And that's where the last big piece of the puzzle, the dependent variable that I had mentioned before, the temperatures of the waters are going to be the last factor, the dependent variable. Our control variable is the pattern in terms of our oscillations. The control member is going to be whether we go El Nino, neutral, or weak La Nina, because that's going to control the entire experiment. Our independent variable is going to be obviously the hurricanes and tropical cyclones, because we obviously don't know where they're going to form. We don't know where the wave energy is going to be. We don't know if the source region here is going to ignite first or this one here, because of that dependent variable, the ocean heat content. And that's why I'd like to propose it from a scientific method kind of standpoint, why we should start exploring and looking at these things and analyzing certain parameters this far out into the future, so we can get a good firm base to stand on and understand where it is we need to be paying close attention to, and at what variables and what dynamics, both in analysis data and long-range forecast data. Thomas, to answer your question, in terms of bad, I've read articles and I've seen comments on this channel that it only takes one bad storm for it to be a bad season. So truthfully, yeah. I'm very, very confident. In fact, I'm willing to put the rest of my lifetime earnings on YouTube and wherever that we're going to see one or two really big landfalls next year. And that's where I'm at 100% certainty. We're going to see some very hellacious landfalls next year. Especially if we trend out of El Nino, we're going to open the floodgates to seeing another Idalia or two wander their way into the Gulf, wander their way up the East Coast, or come straight into the Southeast. So I am very, very confident if we wander out of El Nino, especially, we were in El Nino this year and we did see our one disastrous storm. So imagine if we take El Nino out of the equation, it'll definitely be a bad season. The dust is another entirely, I'll say, uncontrollable variable. We'll definitely need to see exactly what happens with Africa as we start moving through. I believe it was April, May, and June is when we really started to see some good African dust plumes coming off of that continent. So that's going to be a big thing we need to monitor as well. The problem with that is, if we look at it from this year's perspective, El Nino had the Gulf and the Caribbean turned off. So a lot of the storms that tried to get going in the Atlantic for a period of time were smothered by the dust. But a lot of that dust is not really going to influence what can get going in June and July and early August far to the western side of this map. So if you think about it, if we have, and I'll even use a brown color if I have it, if we have dust circulating off of Africa like so, like we saw this year, the MDR is going to be turned off, and anything trying to sneak into the Caribbean may have a chance to get going once it gets closer to Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and pushing towards the Yucatan and Cuba. But the Gulf is going to be ready to rock and roll. And that's another thing I'm a little concerned about too, is if we were not in an El Nino setup, what could Arlene have done at the very beginning of hurricane season? Will we be tracking something? Will there be a yellow blip on National Hurricane Center's homepage as early as there was one this year? we'll have to see. And I think that's even more of a valid reason to start exploring months in advance, because we may not have very much time to get into the hurricane season before we start talking blobs and invests and disturbances. Because we had a blob and an invest and a tropical storm like that on June 1st. As everyone was preparing to say, all right, let's get ready for hurricane season. Psych, we already have a tropical storm, guys. So it's all these little, we have the big picture of hot water and losing El Nino, but then we have all these tiny variables of, well, what happens with the hot water in this area? What happens with the hot water in this area? What happens if the wind shear backs off in this area? What happens if the dust backs off in this area? You know, there's a lot of moving pieces. And if I could characterize it like so, let me do this. I'm going to do something very silly for a second. That didn't help me at all. That did not help me at all. I was going to do something very silly. Nope, never mind. This ain't going to work. All right. We're going to use, we'll use this, I guess. If we look at it from a funnel perspective, we have this sort of a scenario and all the things we want to explore for next hurricane season. At the top, we have OHC and we have SST. That's the overarching theme that everyone's worried about. Then down here, we have, I'll go ahead and do SR. We got source regions. I'll put SR with a little plural S. So ocean heat content, SST, is just the abnormal trend we saw this year. That's the big picture in this funnel here. Then we have our source regions, our SRs. That's a smaller piece of the puzzle, but still a very important, huge piece. And then we obviously have our tropical cyclones. And one could argue that in this area, I'll go ahead and let me do this real quick, because this is going to be the big picture. We have ocean heat content, we have our SSTs, and then we have our SC, our steering currents. So our overarching picture is going to be the ocean heat content and the SSTs, with a little bit of a factor into the equation of what our overall picture is going to look like synoptically and macro scale speaking over Northern Hemisphere. Then we move down to the, the reverse pyramid or the upside down pyramid to, actually I'm thinking. I feel like there's one other thing I want to put in here. I feel like there's something missing, and I brainstormed it earlier. There's another smaller piece of the puzzle I wanted to mention to you guys, and I completely forgot. Shucks, that's going to bother me now. It was literally right there. It was literally right there, and I lost it. I hate it when that happens. But anyways, this is how I would break down approaching next hurricane season. That's the big thing. For lack of a better term, a very, very crude image, if you will, but, I think it does the job. This is our latest ENSO forecast for late in the month November. This is, I guess, where we'll conclude the live stream. Also, why does your mic sound funky? New mic. It does sound funky, but yes, I have my lapel mic right here. This is what I'm going to be using when I transition to in front of a green screen videos for you guys. Lots to watch for. Thank you, Nazar. Did I miss your exam review? Oh, no, I didn't even mention my exam. My exam was okay. I mean, I did all right on it, but it is what it is. I'm just glad the semester's almost over with. I need a chance to breathe. And we had a no-name storm in January. That, too, a no-name storm in January. I'm worried about this hurricane season even more now than before with this. I thought El Nino years were good for Florida. Technically speaking, yeah. Technically speaking. But here's we're going to get another update, I believe, in 2-ish weeks or so. I think this chart drops on the 17th. On the 17th of this month, we're going to get a new updated region or forecast for this, and then we can actually look a little bit beyond July, August, and September. But if you notice, it's the neutral phase that's really screaming out at everybody here. And just based on what I've seen in terms of tropical analysis and looking at the track consensus, neutral is far more lethal for the southeast. Let's see if they have a fancy chart for that. Neutral season hurricane tracks. Well, would you look at that? There you have it. All I'm going to say to this is, dang. That's all I'm going to say to this is a big, big dang. Where did that chart go? Oh, this is a whole paper. I got to take some time to read this. This is a whole paper. So this here is a figure of all the different hurricanes that have made landfall in Florida during neutral seasons. So I may be wandering. I'm gonna be honest. I may be wandering into hype territory, but looks like next year we definitely have a bullet in our back. I should say at least a bullseye on our back. And this lines up very well with what we were looking at on this piece of the puzzle here. How the general consensus is a lot of our neutral storms tend to move up in that general area. This only reinforces that evidence, which is awesome. Where did I go? Where did I lose it? Here we go. It's great that we are onto something. We're putting the puzzle pieces together slowly. There's our track consensus for neutral hurricane season years. And I definitely want to come back to this paper. This is a long paper, but there's a lot of really good information here, it looks like. The main development region of the Atlantic tropical cyclone is a 10 to 20 degree northern latitude. This is consistent with formation region identified as the main region of tropical during, the main region of tropical cyclone formation during neutral years is between 10 and 20 degrees latitude and 40 to 60 degrees west longitude. So we'll probably have a lot of our storms potentially forming somewhere in this quadrant is what they're saying. Which is also going to change the game. That'll definitely change the game. Because this year, if you guys remember, a lot of our storms formed back here. And that gave them the chance to move up. So if we do the same thing and we move those storms from there to there, you can see the general idea is they're going to be moving a lot closer to areas that could possibly get hurt by a bad storm. And yeah, PM, I'll go ahead and drop this in. I definitely want to read this, though. This is really fascinating. This is a huge paper, too. And yeah, if you look, their conclusion does line up because these are going to be the tracks of hurricanes that made landfall during neutral seasons along the East Coast. And you can see that we do have a few long track hurricanes, but most of them did start to pop up in that same general area with a few back over here off the Cabo Verdes. These are your long track hurricanes. Then we have one randomly that came up like this. But good Lord, that's concerning for Florida. This is really cool. We really got to explore this together on a different live stream. This is awesome that they actually have everything broken down into even just different quadrants of lat and long. This right here is a general consensus in the number of formations that ended up hitting Florida. So you could make a case that you could almost use this to make a very, very, very early rough forecast that if we have formation anywhere in this general area, Florida is likely to get hit. Very, very low likelihood that we'll see formations. Well, actually, if I'm reading this right, we have negative numbers down here because they impacted Florida, but they also hit the East Coast. So let's go back up to this other chart up here. Come on, clear the ink. Yeah, so we do have some storms that formed out here and hit Florida, but they also ended up scraping the East Coast and making a more direct landfall in the mid-Atlantic to the Northeast region. This is really cool stuff. What else do they have here? I'm assuming cold years means La Nina. Number of tropical cyclone formations per neutral year. This is really good stuff. This is really good stuff. So that means we're discovering this right now. We could almost make very, very early rough predictions of where we'll likely see a lot of our invest areas come up. And you can see for a neutral hurricane, come on, Penn, I need you to cooperate. For a neutral hurricane season, right in through here. So there you go. If we want to start placing preliminary bets, we're going to see a lot of our storms forming inside the Caribbean next year, if not just outside the Lesser Antilles. We won't see nearly as many long-track Cabo Verde systems. We're actually going to see a lot more of the action in our Western Main Development Region and maybe even into the Eastern Caribbean. This is really cool. I'm going to favorite this. This is going to be a reference I use when my page finally starts getting back up and people start watching again, because this is excellent info I've never seen before. Never seen before. Some of the many factors previously discussed in Section 2 that influence tropical cyclone formation and steering may explain the results found in this work. However, composites created from the NCEP reanalysis of monthly average fields do not allow a detailed investigation of these factors to be performed. The monthly analyses are extremely smooth, hence the composites do not display clear signals. The observation for individual landfall and hurricanes will most likely be blah, 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 blah. The regional differences in hurricane landfall probabilities in the United States are identified with respect to warm, neutral, and cold phases of ENSO. So yeah, warm El Nino, cold La Nina, neutral, obviously we know. Hey, there it is. Emergency planners may benefit from the results of this study. With knowledge of the ENSO phase and its effects on a particular region, one can determine when the probability of a hurricane landfall is the highest. Relative to neutral events, the frequency of hurricane landfalls along the East Coast is found to decrease during ENSO cold and warm events. So, as we mentioned, we definitely noticed a trend. Cold seasons, we see them more west. El Nino, we see them more north. So, neutral season next year, folks. I'm going to go ahead and say it. We have a scientific paper here brought to us by whatever source this is. We'll look at the publisher at the bottom of the chart, or at the bottom of this paper here. Excellent find at the very end of this at the other end of this live stream. But I'm going to start making a plan and prepping, not only for the house, but also for storm chasing. Because I think next year is going to be it. We're going to have a repeat of 2004. I'm getting chills. My little extreme meteorologist is coming out. It's the writing's here. The hurricane season that occurs before La Nina winter is the most likely to see a landfalling hurricane along the East Coast. In Florida, there is no difference observed in the frequency of hurricane landfalls between cold and neutral events. The lack of difference in cold and neutral hurricane landfalls in Florida as compared to the difference observed along the East Coast is due to a decrease in East Coast hurricane landfalls during neutral events, rather than a decrease in Florida land. Okay, so what they're saying here is there is no difference between La Nina landfalls and neutral landfalls. The big difference is where the storms track after hitting Florida. In a La Nina, if they hit Florida, they're likely still progressing to the west. or at least headed, we'll say if we have a Francis or a Jean, they're going towards the Panhandle, towards the Gulf Coast, or like a Katrina or a Rita or another, I'm trying to think of another example, or a Katrina or a Rita or like an Ivan in 2004. They're likely moving this way. In a neutral season, they're likely moving like this. So they're either coming up from the south like an Irma or a Charlie or an Ian, or they're possibly hitting the East Coast and gutting the state and going up towards the mid-Atlantic states. This is awesome. I really need to sit down and look at all of this information. Because it even has stuff mentioning monthly averages of pressure, height, wind, and sea surface temp fields were insufficient, revealing any particular pattern or explain the results obtained in this analysis. It is necessary to investigate these patterns on a smaller time scale. 6 hourly conditions of sea surface temp, vertical shear, low level vorticity, 500 to 700 millibar winds in the week previous to each hurricane landfall would be more useful in determining the subtle differences in conditions during cold and neutral years. Also, a correlation between North American oscillation phase and landfall was not observed. Further investigation is needed in order to gain a better understanding of the mechanisms suppressing East Coast hurricane landfalls during neutral years. So this is really good stuff. Let's see, regions of formation, tracks of landfalling hurricanes. The track of hurricanes that make landfall on the East Coast during neutral years mainly originate in one region off the Cape Verde Islands. These storms tend to recurve near the Leeward Islands, very similar to what we saw this year, and head towards the East Coast. During the cold years, the East Coast landfalling hurricanes tend to form in the central Atlantic. It is interesting to note that during the cold phase, no storm that makes landfall on the East Coast hits Florida first. Also, hurricanes that make landfall on the East Coast tend to hit further north during cold years than during neutral years. Only 5 of the 46 hurricanes to make landfall on the East Coast between 1900 and 1998 made landfall in Georgia. Of these 5, 1 hit during a warm year, an El Nino, and the remaining 4 occurred during neutral years. No hurricane has ever made landfall in Georgia during a cold event. Wow, very good to know. The tracks stay further to the east, indicating the likely presence of an upper-level trough that is blocking the storms from tracking any further west. This does not occur in the neutral phase, thus more storms are able to push further west, hitting Florida as the East Coast. This is dope. I like this. This is sick. I'm really liking this a lot. This is kind of almost predicting next hurricane season without us really needing to look at anything. We're already going to know what's coming. Definitely going to hang on to this. I'm glad I saved it. I'm not going to disagree with official sources. Nope, neither am I. National Weather Service is not accurate. Sorry, local Met said 2017 was a La Nina. Got work in the morning, so going to sign off. Yes, even you, Nazaria, how could I not? Your channel is great and seen worldwide. Hope you're doing your homework, meteorologist. Oh, absolutely. What else we got? I looked at all historical tracks. I knew this year wasn't a big year for us because El Nino and La Nina means less likely, but there are exceptions. 2017 was a Nina, Irma. Yes, that makes sense. So I like this a lot. This is really cool. I definitely want to digest a lot of this stuff. There it is. Figure after the sentence here, during a neutral event, there are an average of 0.39 hurricane landfalls per year along the East Coast and 0.67 landfalling hurricanes per year in Florida. This right here is where I'm going to end the stream right here, guys. There appears to be a significant decrease in hurricane landfalls during the neutral phase along the East Coast, whereas compared to Florida. This would suggest that there is a dominant flow pattern during neutral years that tends to steer hurricanes towards Florida. And that's where I'm going to leave it. We're going to go ahead and end the stream right there because there's a lot more of this that I want to dig into. And with this, I want to try to find as many different charts and archived products to do my own little after-action analysis and see if I can pick up on some of the trends that they're noting in this paper and then translate it over to what our models are showing so I can communicate it to you guys in future updates. Because this paper and other papers that might actually, we can now discover, looking at the same kind of criteria, we might be able to go into next hurricane season. My second statement is going to be very, 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 very frivolous, I'll say. Is going to be very, very bold. The first statement is we can already start to make preliminary warnings for certain areas. We can put a watch out for a future watch for certain areas of the Caribbean, of the Antilles, and for the Southeast. If we can find even more research that supports what we're reading in this one article here, this one paper. The second statement I'm going to make is going to be extremely bold, but we might be one of the leading sources on social media in terms of projecting where these storms go if we look closely at the trends highlighted in this research paper. We won't really even need the models or the ensembles. We'll already know how to look at the overall weather pattern and determine where we're going to see formation. If an area is primed for formation, which I'm very excited that they have these charts down here included right here, where on average, where you're likely to see most of your formation. This is awesome. We could almost go into next hurricane season looking at the computer models and saying, nope, yep, nope, yep, and so on and so forth. So this is really good stuff. I really need to do extra homework now, and I'm glad the semester is coming to an end because I can spend time on this type of homework as opposed to class homework and really look at what it is that they're researching here. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here that I want to research. A lot of stuff that I want to research and put some notes together going forward so we can try to become as much of a subject matter expert on next hurricane season as possible, looking at some of these old findings, and then maybe reinforce these findings with some new experimentation as we go into next summer. That one sentence up here that I have highlighted is where I want to end the live stream, as well as here. The tracks stay further east, indicating the likely presence of an upper trough. That does not happen in a neutral phase. If anybody's watching this after this live stream ends, I'm not worrying about just Florida. I'm not worrying about just Florida. For my folks out there who watch in the Caribbean, for all those people who joined this channel who are probably not watching now in the Antilles, in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, Cayman Islands, I'm worrying about all of us next year. Because if we pair this setup with the warm waters, we could have very deadly hurricanes hitting these areas. But room for speculation and research. Will the hot waters influence the steering patterns? Problem with that, though, is if we still see warm waters in the Atlantic, but we do see the cooling trend in the Pacific, then likely we will still see very similar semi-permanent patterns in the Atlantic to an extent. So that may not help us, in fact, almost hurt us. So we will see. We shall see. This was a great live stream. Excellent that we could bolster it with a little bit of official data that was concluded. Let's go down to the bottom and see who wrote this. Wow, a lot of sources. Funding for this research was provided by the National Oceanic and NOAA Office of Global Programs. Additional funding was provided by NASA. Lots of references. And you know what? These are all references that we can go back and look into after this live stream and going forward for next year. Because we look at all this and we see where we could possibly see storms track as a piece of the puzzle, and then we can start looking at possibly what these abnormal temperatures are going to do with these storms and where they're tracking. Can start slowly piecing it together. But all right, folks, if I keep talking about this, we're not going to end the stream, and I definitely need to get going. It's 8:10. I got stuff to prep for a car show tomorrow. Past performance is not a guarantee of future performance. No, you're right. I will make a prediction next week. Early prediction. Potential for a busy season, Central and South Florida 2024. I agree. A neutral season can be just as busy as a La Nina. Yep, because we will have the favorable conditions reset up. A La Nina doesn't mean that we get the favorable conditions. A neutral means the wind shear backs off and that becomes the favorable setup. La Nina only reinforces the favorable setup. So let's see. Let's see, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you wouldn't mind, share this live stream if you can. Let's try to get some eyes on it. Not necessarily for the views or anything like that, but just to try to get some other official sources who may discover it and try to chime in so we can start a conversation between now and when it matters most. Like you said, where I just saw it. Let's relax. There we go, Robert. Robert, like he said, next few months, let's talk, let's research, let's do our homework, and then we can start getting hyped when we can finally see close enough in time to if El Nino is collapsing, if we do see this neutral phase setting up, and what our pattern is doing. So I agree. Right about April timeframe is when we'll have a better idea of what's coming. So, yeah. Nomad Cat 4, I don't argue with that. Because you know what? If we are in a neutral pattern, we may not see boom, 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 boom of hurricanes, but I feel like we'll definitely get another Ian or a Charlie. So we'll see. But all right, guys. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again probably on either tomorrow night or Sunday, maybe. Tomorrow's going to be very busy. Sunday's going to be a family day. We'll see what happens. 2005 was moving into a La Nina, if I'm not mistaken, April. So we'll see what happens, to be determined. I'll probably put an announcement out on YouTube, and we'll see when I'm going to pop back up with another live stream or another discussion. But we'll see what happens. Yeah, Francis and Jean in 2004. Following the track that we just read about in the document here. So I'm going to keep this saved, and I'm going to definitely take a lot of notes from it and start referencing a lot of these sources here that they have on the back side of this. But all right, guys, we'll talk to you very soon. Yeah, rapid fire, I agree. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you had a wonderful start to December. I really hope you're looking forward to Christmas and New Year's. And I hope that you start planning. If not, you've already started to finalize your goals and your resolutions for next year. One of them being, for me personally, is to continue to broaden and sharpen my skills to bring information like this to you guys and be as reputable and reliable of a source as possible. A little bit of hype speckled in there when it matters most, but a lot of the science behind it presented first before we allow any hype to get up in there. You know what I mean? That's how you properly forecast. You explain the science, you break it down so everyone understands, and when it's time to hype, you hype up. All right? So we'll see you guys again very soon. You the man, Naz, have a great time tomorrow. I'm going to do my best. I'm excited. It's up in Daytona Beach. So if you guys are local to the Daytona area and you're near the ocean, something, let me look real fast. I was searching it earlier. If you're near the Wxcenter in Daytona Beach, come on out. We'll be there. Tomorrow from 1 to 7 p.m. Awards are at 6 p.m. We'll see if my Betty can take home another trophy. I don't know. She got a lot of dust we got to dust off, so we'll see. But, yeah, if you're local to the Daytona Beach area, you're more than welcome to come out and say hello. That'd be great. But, all right, folks. We will see you very soon. Thank you all for watching. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, leave them in the bottom comment section below of this live stream video or drop me a line on Instagram. I'll always get back to you. Have a great rest of your December 1st, folks. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you tomorrow, if not Sunday. But either way, we'll see you again soon. This is Wxcenter Nazario, signing out.